Okay, we're going to start talking about Chapter 11, in which we talk about the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, and how they function in movement. So basically, they're going to be, I'm going to do this in 4 sections. First, we're going to talk about the basal ganglia, then we're going to talk about basal ganglia disorders, then we'll talk about the cerebellum, and then cerebellum disorders, and a little bit about postural control because both of those function really well in postural control. So we'll first start to talk about the basal ganglia, and since I work in a specialty Parkinson's program, LSVT big, of course I'm very interested in the basal ganglia, and so if I go on and on about Parkinson's, you can just roll your eyes and say, there she goes again. But I will try not to go on and on about Parkinson's. So the basal ganglia, they have all sorts of nifty functions for us. They predict the effects of various actions, and then they make and execute action plans. So it's not just motor functions that the basal ganglia have, that also has executive and planning functions. So very important. So when we talk about basal ganglia, ganglia, is a plural, and it is a collection of nuclei, and nuclei are collections of neurons, located throughout the brain, throughout the cerebrum and brain stem, and they perform all these great functions for us. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the components of the basal ganglia, but I do not expect you to memorize these. I'm just talking about them so you know about them, okay? And maybe later on you'll see the word somewhere and you'll recognize it. So these are all just different nuclei, and the collection of nuclei together are called the basal ganglia. So, and I have a nifty picture of them all too. So the caudate is one of the ganglia. It's located in the cerebrum. The putamen, also located in the cerebrum. The globus pallidus is located in the cerebrum. The subthalamic nucleus is located within the diencephalon, just like the top of the brainstem, where the hypothalamus and all that important stuff is. The substantia nigra is located in the midbrain. And the substantia nigra, those are the cells that produce dopamine, the neurotransmitter dopamine, and that's the cells that start to die off in Parkinson's. Okay, so here is a nifty picture of the brain, and it shows where all these little guys are. So when we talk about the basal ganglia, like it's one thing, but it's not. It's a group of nuclei that perform common functions, or perform this whole group of functions, and you can see kind of how spread out they are. And substantia nigra, basically it's those dark black cells, and when you see the a picture of someone's brain who has Parkinson's, they don't have those black cells. They're gone. Those cells have died off and they're no longer producing dopamine. So we know from way back in chapter 3 when we're talking about neurotransmitter, dopamine has a lot more to do than just movement. It's a neurotransmitter that functions in a lot of areas in our behavioral and cognitive functions. So that's a big deal when we don't have dopamine. So we'll talk a little bit about the neurotransmitters in the basal ganglia circuit, but first we're going to look at some different pretty pictures of the basal ganglia. So I don't know why, I just think this picture's cool, and it shows the location of some of the different parts of the basal ganglia. And again, I don't expect you to memorize the names or anything, but it's like a 3D representation of the basal ganglia. And then also that same cross section of the brain, which I think is just super cool. These, if you're an anatomy geek, you might like this. If you're not, well, just glaze over it. All these diagrams are in the book. If you're a real anatomy geek, there's a little 3.5-minute neuroanatomy brain slice video in the module that is really cool. So if you want to geek out, go ahead and geek out. If you don't want to, then you don't have to. So the basal ganglia motor circuit, which of course motor things we're concerned a lot about in physical therapy, it regulates muscle contraction, muscle force, multi-joint movements and sequencing of movements. So you can see how if any of those are out of whack, it can really affect the quality and amplitude of your movements. So the basal ganglia regulate muscle contraction, tone, and force. They control speed and fluidity of movement. They prevent unwanted movement. So we talked a little bit in chapter 10 about unwanted movements like tremors and spasticity and stuff. So the basal ganglia motor circuit prevents some of those unwanted movements by using inhibitory functions. It helps regulate multi-joint movements and sequencing of movements. So really important in your motor strategies. It selects and inhibits specific motor synergies, so it allows us to do a lot of the actions that we do because you have to inhibit some of those motor synergies. It initiates automatic and repetitive skills like playing the piano or driving a car. It's not like every time we drive a car we have to figure it out from scratch. You get to the point where it's automatic. You just get in the car and you do it, and your basal ganglia is controlling and initiating a lot of that stuff. And it also affects some of your voluntary muscles and postural girdle muscles. So that's a big deal in Parkinson's, those postural muscles, and you start to get this characteristic Parkinson's posture where someone's bent forward, and we'll have some pictures of people, some videos of gait, which is kind of interesting. So the functioning basal ganglia are vital for normal movements, but they do not have a direct connection to lower motor neurons. They influence through other areas by being part of that inhibitory cycle. So the basal ganglia's influences through motor areas of the cerebral cortex and through the pedunculopontine nucleus, or the PPN, and we'll just call it the PPN from now on, so I don't have to say that word, in the midbrain. So it's, even though it has a vital function in normal movement patterns, there's no direct connection to the lower motor neurons. So there's a little diagram, and this is figure 11.3 in the book, which just sort of simplifies. It shows the 3 tracks by which the basal ganglia play their role in movement, and they can either facilitate or inhibit actions. And so the red arrows in the diagram are facilitating and the black arrows are inhibiting. You see the basal ganglia has an inhibitory function on at the beginning of all 3 of these areas of action in its system. So when we talked about the steps in motor planning, or from when a motor task gets initiated to when it actually happens, there's that inhibitory part in there, and that prevents unwanted movement to go in there. So the basal ganglia group plays a big role in that, and so they do it through 3 different paths. One of them is the basal ganglia inhibits the motor thalamus, which then functions on the motor cortex, the cortical spinal tracts, the lower motor neurons, and the voluntary muscles. It inhibits the PPN nucleus, which in turn inhibits the reticulospinal tracts, which then has function on the lower motor neurons and the postural and girdle muscles. So when that inhibition is missing, you get hyperactivity of the postural muscles, and that's where you get the stiffness in Parkinson's. It has an inhibitory effect on the midbrain locomotor region, which affects the reticulospinal tracts and stepping pattern generators and the lower motor neurons, and it functions in walking. So one of the big things we work on in Parkinson's therapy is walking and reestablishing normal walking patterns. Because we're not getting that inhibition, you get a lot of stiffness in walking. You get where people don't move their arms. So that inhibition, even though the basal ganglia's motor functions are inhibitory for the most part, when you don't get that inhibition, you get abnormal movement patterns. So really interesting stuff. I wrote this in bold at the bottom of the page on the module, just so you get this. I don't necessarily expect you to memorize this level of detail and to know the exact tracks and what's affected, but I just want you to be aware that the basal ganglia are working in 3 different routes to regulate movement. So they're regulating voluntary muscles, postural and girdle muscles, and all of the patterns involved in walking, but they're doing it by 3 different routes. Okay, and it's the basal ganglia have an inhibitory effect on all 3 of those routes. So if you don't have inhibition of the motor thalamus, you get excess activation of voluntary muscles, and that causes a tremor. If you don't have inhibition in the PPN nucleus, you get excess tone in the postural and girdle muscles, and that causes the stiffness and slowness of Parkinson's. If you don't have inhibition in the midbrain locomotor region, you get overactivation of the stepping pattern generators, and you get weird movement patterns with walking. So the basal ganglia use those 3 different routes to regulate movement in those 3 areas: voluntary muscles, postural and girdle muscles, and walking. So really that's what you should know. So if you're just like, wow, you're so fascinated with the basal ganglia and you want more in-depth information about those direct initiations of movements and direct inhibition of movements, you can watch these videos, but you do not have to. That's just there for you as a resource, okay? Or, you know, maybe you don't want to look at it now because you've got too much other stuff to study, but later on you know it's there and you can go back and look at it. Okay, so that's just, let me throw that out there for you. So there in the PowerPoint, again, I have some additional information about the basal ganglia motor circuits, and we'll talk about it a little bit, but I will let you know specifically the level of detail that I want you to know for the exam, for example. But the neurotransmitter, or the basal ganglia circuit, works by delivering certain neurotransmitters. So the cortical motor areas use the transmitter glutamate, and we know that's an excitatory neurotransmitter. Dopamine from the substantia nigra adjusts the signals to the output nuclei to provide the appropriate level of inhibition to those 3 pathways we just talked about. So if you don't have the appropriate level of inhibition, you get tremors, you get stiffness and slowness of movement, and you get abnormal movement patterns. Okay. So the problem in Parkinson's in particular, and we'll talk about some other basal ganglia disorders as well, but it's lack of dopamine because the substantia nigra cells are not producing it, and so lack of dopamine doesn't provide the appropriate level of inhibition, and you get tremors, stiffness and slowness, and weird movement patterns, or abnormal movement patterns. I don't know if the word weird is clinically correct. So the output of the basal ganglia motor circuit regulates muscle contraction, muscle force, multi-joint movements, and sequencing of movements. So sequencing of movements is important. So how I was saying, in Parkinson's, a lot of people, they lose that reciprocal arm-leg movement in walking, and they just kind of hold their arms down at their sides. They don't move their arms, and that affects your balance because the arms act as a pendulum in balance, and so it messes up their sequence of movements. So there are lots of different areas which we looked at, those little pathways that are involved in the motor circuit. Okay, so it has that huge effect on movement, but no direct output to lower motor neurons, which is kind of cool. And then it's just, there's a little sentence for each one of those pathways. Table 11.1 from the book that just talks about the different structures and their roles. And again, I do not want you to memorize this information, so don't even think about it. So I'm trying to limit the amount of stuff you have to memorize. I want you to understand concepts and not so much memorization. But the basal ganglia, besides their motor functions, they also have a huge effect on executive function, social, behavioral, and emotional functions. So there are a lot of different loops that go from the basal ganglia to the thalamus, the oculomotor loop, the executive loop, behavioral flexibility and control, and the limbic loop. So they contribute to the prediction of future events, selecting desired behaviors, preventing undesired behaviors, motor learning, shifting attention, and spatial and working memory. So you can imagine how this would affect things like, say, you are in a car, you're driving, so your basal ganglia are controlling some of that automatic movement function, right? You're driving. You see way ahead of you, or you see a little ways ahead of you, that the light is turning yellow. So you have to sort of predict what the future events might be. If I were to run that yellow light, or gun it so I went through on the yellow and not on the red, so I have to predict my future events. What's going to happen? I have to select the appropriate behaviors. Am I going to hit the gas or am I going to hit the brake? I have to prevent the undesired behavior, so whichever one I didn't pick, I have to prevent doing that. I have to use all my, the motor learning that went into learning how to drive, shifting my attention, like what if I had decided to hit the gas, I'm going to try to go for the yellow, but all of a sudden I see a bicyclist coming up from one side. It shift my attention, and I decide I'm going to select another course of events. And so there's a lot going on, and the basal ganglia are all involved in that. And it can all be, there's this really like super cool chart on the social and behavioral and emotional functions, and this is way more complicated than I want you to know. And but it does show like the different areas of the basal ganglia and what executive and emotional functions they're involved in, which is kind of neat and interesting stuff. Like the head of the caudate is part of the decision-making loop that participates in goal-directed behavior. So goal-directed behavior is one of the things that is different between adults and children. Children often don't have goal-directed behavior until we train them to do it. It evaluates information for making perceptual decisions and planning and choosing the appropriate actions to do in the context of the situation, and learning, and what are the reward, the benefits of doing a certain activity. So all of these things, there are executive and our social and behavioral functions. They're not really involved in controlling movements. They're involved in that decision-making process. So you can imagine if that's not functioning correctly, how that would affect your life. So that's the example from the text, and I took out the anatomical details just to make it a little more accessible. So you imagine you're driving to a job interview and you're running late. Of course, you should have left early, but that's just me talking. So the green traffic light turns yellow. Your basal ganglia evaluate how heavy the traffic is, how much time you have, whether to risk running the light as it turns red. Once the decision is made by that executive decision-making loop, the motor loop initiates hitting the brakes or accelerating. So you're making that decision. So in a different, the other part of the example is you're driving to the grocery store, you got all the time in the world, it's your day off, you're feeling relaxed, you're at the same intersection, the light turns yellow, and the same area in the basal ganglia evaluates the whole context of the situation and selects the appropriate action. So it's a big part of our decision making, and so if it's not functioning properly, so of course in the therapy world we're talking about movement and movement therapy a lot, but this comes into it as well. Behavioral flexibility and control, that's one of the things that as Parkinson's advances, people with more advanced Parkinson's have less behavioral flexibility, and they have it takes them longer to make decisions. So it's just interesting that that group of nuclei in our brain controls so many vital functions that really make our day-to-day life livable and possible. So I'm going to wrap this section up, and in the next section we're going to start talking about movement disorders of the basal ganglia, and there are basically two types of movement disorders. We're going to talk about hypokinetic, which is less movement, and hyperkinetic, which is more movement. So we'll talk about that in the next section.